Before we begin the lesson, there's a point that I've thought about many times when I've sang this song. If you look in the chorus of the song, it says, "Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone." Sometimes we describe courage as a lack of fear, and I'm not certain that that's true in the absolute sense. But I do realize that sometimes we use words in different ways, and sometimes we use fear to speak of dread. When Jesus was in the garden praying the night before his crucifixion, I'm certain from the words that he used that there was dread of what the coming day would hold. But at the same time, I'm also certain in the sense of fear that the outcome would not be as he was promised it would be, he did not have. He realized that after his crucifixion that he would ascend back to the Father and the Lord's church would be established, and he knew that. So I think when you sing that song, sometimes people are thinking if we obey the gospel that everything unpleasant in life will be gone. And as Brother Dalton mentioned in his prayer, that's not always true. That there are things that are difficult to handle in life and we have to deal with them. And I think it's not uncommon for us to dread things that we're going to have to do. I mean, if you're like me and you know you're going to have a root canal, you probably dread that. But fear in the sense of thinking that there's going to be a bad outcome, there's really not, in my mind. I mean, I've had several of them. The dentist has been very good. So I kind of look at it as something that will be some short-term pain for some long-term gain. And that's kind of the way it is with life. So I think you just, and I say that because I believe a lot of modern preachers, and especially a lot of the TV evangelists, have preached a message that has turned people off because they promised them that if they obey the gospel, they have no problems at all, that every problem will be solved, that there will be no temptation, that everything will be perfect. And it's not that way. And the New Testament doesn't promise it. Now, are there things that I dread in life? Yes. Do I fear that God will not keep his word? No. I believe that God will keep his word. If I, in fact, am saved, it will be because I kept my part of the covenant, because I know that God will keep his. I know and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which he has committed to me against that day, as Paul would say and as our song would say. So I think we need to be careful with the word fear. I think sometimes we have a sense of guilt because when we have dread for certain things, we think that that's a sign that we don't trust God. You just need to go back and read the account of the last night of the life of Jesus to realize that's not so. He did not look forward to that coming day. He realized that it would be a terrible, excruciating day, and it certainly was. But he also recognized that at the end of that God would keep his word. And therefore the fear that sometimes people have that causes them to just give up was not there. So we need to trust God. Now, our lesson this morning is going to deal with a very familiar parable. And I will tell you very truthfully that this lesson came about because I sometimes look at myself and evaluate myself. And one of the evaluations that I have of myself is that if I'm not careful, I'm prone to make excuses for things and to tell you things. And we need to stop and realize that in reality, what we really are doing at times is we're just simply saying that our priorities need some changing. If you look at this parable, he uses the word excuse. And it's interesting as he uses the word excuse that when you look at the things that are stated here, that what he's really going to demonstrate to you was that the problem in each case was that the priorities in these people's lives were simply not set appropriately. And that's what we're going to emphasize here this morning. Let's read verse 15 through 24 of Luke 14. When one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he saith unto him, Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Then Jesus said unto him, A certain man made a great supper and bade many, and sent his servants at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. Now you remember that I have preached many times, and I believe have made an accurate statement, that when you don't want to do something, one excuse is as good as another. It doesn't really matter. It's not based in fact anyway, so you can say anything you please. So when they with one consent began to make excuses, that's what he's basically saying. They all didn't want to go, and they invented different reasons that were not reasons. They were simply excuses because of their priorities. The first one said unto him, I bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee have me excused. Another said, I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, therefore I cannot come. And of course, you need to realize that this is based upon a Jewish conversation with people who knew the law well. Under Jewish law, when a person married, then he was excluded from military service for a year. He didn't have to go to the military for a year after that marriage. And that's basically what it's talking about. This man said, I married a wife and I cannot come. Kind of extended it beyond that idea of service. And that servant came and showed his Lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor, the maimed, the halt, and the blind. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, commit them and compel them to come, that thy house may be filled. For I say unto you that none of these men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. Now, let's look at what's stated here and let's think about it a bit. You know, if you have an illness and you go to the doctor, what are you really interested in doing? Are you interested in dealing with the symptoms of what's ailing you? Or are you really trying to find out what the cause is so that you'll be able to solve the problem and then move on with your life? Think about this. If we simply deal with the symptom, we do nothing to correct the problem. In our world, we have a serious problem with drug abuse. Now, one of the problems that we have in this area is that most people do not consider alcohol to be a part of that problem, but it is probably the biggest part of that problem. Alcohol is a drug, like any other drug. It is a mind-altering drug. And people use it to deal with the symptoms of the problems of their life. I mean, if you're watching a movie and a man and his wife have an argument and the man goes to the bar and sits down and drinks a half bottle of whiskey, what's he trying to do? Remove the symptoms of the problem. Does it remove the problem? Does it deal with the root cause? Well, the answer is no. When we look into our world today, we find, for example, that when we look at the last few months with all the people who've been kept home, they don't work, they don't go to school, they don't socialize, and so we've seen a sharp rise in suicides. We've seen an extremely sharp rise in overdose drug deaths from opioid abuse. Why? Because people are having a hard time dealing with their life as it is, and they're trying to deal with the symptom of loneliness, but the problem is they're not really dealing with the cause. And so no matter how much they drink and no matter how many pills they take, the cause is not removed. And so it's a never-ending cycle. If you think about it, Tylenol is probably the most familiar name. Used to be aspirin was the most familiar drug that you could mention. I think Tylenol's kind of replaced it. And nowadays, Tylenol is it. In fact, when you go buy acetaminophen. Most people say go and get some Tylenol, even though that may not be the brand name, but we've kind of come to call it that. And Tylenol is used primarily to reduce fever. That's the biggest thing that it's used for. How many times you take it? You ever look at the bottle? Does it say, if you take this Tylenol, your problem is solved and you'll have no more fever? That's not what it says. Every 4 to 6 hours as needed. Is it not true? And so it relieves the symptom a little bit. But whatever the cause is, whether it's the flu or whether it's COVID or whether it's pneumonia or whether it's whatever it is, stomach virus, whatever it is, it'll help you with that symptom, but it doesn't do anything to solve the underlying problem that is causing the symptom. Let's think a little bit about it. Get my air back where it belongs. If you see a child doing something dangerous, they're doing something really dangerous, and you just move them away from the danger. Now, we're assuming here that we're dealing with toddlers who are old enough to kind of understand things. You don't just go pick them up. If they're putting their hand on something that don't need to be, generally you kind of swat that hand a little bit because you're trying to say to them, don't put your hand back there. Now, removing them from it will solve the problem. We'll just pick them up, move them to another part of the room temporarily. But if you just pick a child up and have no kind of disciplinary action to pick them up and move to the other side of the room, and this is interesting, where they're going to go, right back to it. And so you don't really solve the problem. You just simply deal with the symptom. Now, in the same way, when someone offers an excuse for their behavior, unless they're really thinking about making some changes, then there's not much benefit to that. Have you ever watched a TV program where there's a family dispute? Brothers and sisters get into it. One of them does something they certainly ought not do. Now, if you've been in a family like mine I've got 5 brothers and sisters, and really 3 of them were close enough to me that I was around them a lot. Others were so much older I really wasn't. But I've had this experience. I've had my mother say to me, you go apologize to your sister. Many times. And I would. I'd go say, I'm sorry. But that didn't solve the problem. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 23, God recognizes that. So he talks about alcohol use, or abuse, as you might say, and what it causes in a person's life. And even though we look at it and we see all the things it caused, and he said, they have stricken me, thou shalt say, I was not sick, they have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? And you know, the last words of that is, I will seek it yet again. In the state of Tennessee, not long ago, we had a young man who happened to be a student at Austin Peay University, and I think the first escapade that day was actually on the campus, who had to receive Narcan 4 times. And I mentioned this a lot of times. 4 times in a single day to keep him from dying. Now, let me ask you a question. What did the Narcan do? Did it solve his problem? I don't know what his problem was. I have no clue. I don't know the young man. But I can tell you this, the Narcan didn't solve his problem. It dealt with the symptom of it, but it didn't solve the problem. Sometimes when you talk about people attempting suicide, I'll tell you something. I'm a pretty intelligent person. If I decide to kill myself, nobody's going to be talking about attempted suicide. When it's over, they're going to be talking about suicide. I'm going to be gone because I believe I understand well enough what needs to be done to accomplish that end. Sometimes when people attempt suicide, it's really not. And so we get excited and we try to say we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But what is the real answer, and what have we learned? What we've learned is if you really want to solve the problem and the person didn't succeed, or maybe they really weren't trying, I don't know which, but anyway, whichever way went, you send them to a counselor, and what's the counselor trying to do? Trying to remove the problem. That's what they're trying to do. Now, you may say, what's all this have to do with what we've been talking about here in this lesson? And what does this have to do with this parable? Let me tell you something. Excuse making is a means of dealing with a symptom without dealing with the problem. That's what it is. Excuse making is a way of dealing with a symptom. It makes us feel better. It kind of relieves all the physical consequence, but it doesn't solve the problem, whatever the problem might be. Let me show you something that's interesting. In this particular case, Jesus had been here involved in giving some parables to these people. He was here in the house of one of the chief Pharisees on the Sabbath, and he's talking. And at the end of his conversation with them, as the end of his speech, if you please, one of them that sat at meat, one of the persons there made this statement. You might think it to be Jesus who made the statement, but it was not. It was one of the persons who was there and said, "Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." He made a commitment that he accepted Jesus as being certainly something to be lifted up. Whether he understood him to be the Messiah or not, I don't know, but it's obvious that he was accepting him and accepting his teaching as being something that should guide his life. How did Jesus respond? You know, the man who spoke to Jesus extolled the value of spiritual things and said, "Oh, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." Jesus is a realist. And Jesus understood that having someone say something such as this has no real value until what that person has said, as we've been studying the book of James, exhibits itself by the things that person does. Jesus pointed out that while we may understand the value of the spiritual, what this man did, he said, "Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." We will fail in our service if we prioritize, in this particular case, he mentions 3 other parts of our life. One of the things that's always bothered me is a lot of people over the years, and I can remember many, many years ago, and the first time I ever saw the chart was James P. Miller was preaching, and he used to draw that chart, and he'd draw a pie and put slices in it. And he said the problem that we Christians have is that this little slice here is the spiritual side. That's on Sunday. That's the time that we worship. And then all these other parts we consider to be a different aspect of our life, and in reality it's not. That they all are part of one pie. I mean, you just think about this. Suppose that you're at my house and I take a piece of pie, as we were talking about in our service this morning, and I cut a piece off and I go to the cupboard and get some decon and stick a little bit in there and then slide it back in the pie. You want some? Just think about it and understand what he's saying. Jesus is saying it, yeah, people say the spiritual is the most important. That's what's important to us. But now look at the excuses that were offered in this parable. And what Jesus is trying to do is to impress upon these people, getting people to say that God is the most important thing in my life is not hard. Not hard. Getting people to act like God is the most important thing in their life is hard. This first man that he came to, he offered an excuse. And he said, "I bought a piece of ground. I want to go see it." Let me ask you something. When I was in school, and I guess it may be something that's still around, I don't know, we used to have these pens that were disappearing ink. You ever see any of them? It was kind of cool. You'd write something out, and then you'd sit there a few minutes and it'd disappear. And it was no longer there. Now, do you think land's like that? Do you think land's like that? Like I bought it today, and if I don't get out there and see it today, it's going to disappear and it won't be there anymore. Obviously, this is an excuse. Lamp will be there for the rest of his life, whatever time that might be, and he could look at it any time he wanted to. But the problem is with priorities. He considered it more important to go look at the land than it was to go to the wedding feast, the feast that had been prepared. That's the problem. When you go back to Matthew chapter 6, Verse 19 through 24, Jesus dealt with that in the Sermon on the Mount. Here's what he said. And this man who's offering an excuse, really needs a good dose of these verses. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Because after all, think of the land the man possessed. I've mentioned several times in preaching recently, I think the size of a grave is about around 4 by 8. That's about right. A little bigger than that maybe. When you die, that's what you're going to possess. And you really don't possess it because I don't know exactly how long from now, but there will come a time that there will be no evidence of your existence physically. It will not be there. It will be gone. So you really don't possess it. You kind of have a long-term lease, but you don't possess it. And he said, you don't lay up for yourself because all these things are corruptible. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through and steal. For where your treasury is, and this is the key, for where your treasury is, there will your heart be also. That's what has to do with priorities. What is a priority? Think about the things that fill your life, and the thing that fills the most of it is kind of where your priorities lie. You ever listen to Dave Ramsey and he talks about economics? He kind of goes down the list and tells you if you don't have so much money, what do you pay first? Go buy groceries because you starve to death if you don't. Well, you pay second. Well, you might not pay your rent. You won't have a place to live. What's the third thing? Well, you might need some electricity and some water. So you kind of go down a priority list. Isn't life like that? What's the number one priority in your life? What should be the thing at the top of the list? And that's really what he's talking about in this particular passage. Where your treasury is, there will your heart be also. I've heard people say that if you want to know about a man and what's important to him, get his checkbook. Look down through his checkbook and see what he wrote checks for, and you'll realize what's important to him. Most people who have children will tell you, they look at their friends who have none, they're really prospering sometimes, and it's a joke. Well, you know what? They didn't have any kids. Because those kids become your priority at that particular point. You don't have any choice. Not something you choose to do, something you do. And he said, your heart will be also. The light of the body is the eye, and therefore, if thine eye be single, thy whole body should be full of light. A lot of people had trouble with that. But the idea is that if it centers on the thing that is important, it will be great. But if thine eye be evil, that is, if you center on things that are not, the whole body should be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? No man can serve two masters, he said. When you look at life, whatever it is that you're involved in, priorities are going to be set, and you can't have equal priorities. When Brian and I were establishing a business several years ago, an LLC, our CPA at that time was Ron Curtis, who's since passed away. And Ron said to me, when we were talking about it, he said, the one thing you do not do is set up an LLC as a 50-50 partnership. Never. He said it has to be 51-49. Somebody has to be the person at the top. It's the way it is with everything in life. Somebody has to be the person. Something has to be. When it comes down to it, something will take priority and everything else will be left off. Let's think about this. Sometimes we can put our occupation above God. Having to look at my clock, that one's not working. Have to look at consider occupation. And some people, that's the most important thing in their life. And in some ways, it's kind of hard sometimes to recognize that, and to realize that. But I think Luke 12 is probably the greatest example that demonstrates it so you don't have any problem recognizing it. Here's a man's a farmer. And his farm brings forth a lot. Brings forth plentifully, he said. And what does he do? Just say, man, I can take better care of my family now. I can give more to the church. I can give more to benevolent organizations. I can do a lot of good. No, that's not what he said. What shall I do because I have no rooms wherein to bestow my fruits? This will I do. Here's my priority. I'll pull down my barns and build greater. And I'll produce more crops. And there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. We've become, over the last several years in our country, a nation that really thinks a lot about retirement. And I think people used to all thought that we're going to retire at 50 and we're going to go swimming and fishing and golfing and we're going to have a big time. You ever known anybody do that? What happens after a while? They usually find something else to do. I remember one time Debbie was telling me about some folks that bought them a RV, going to just travel the country, and that's all they're going to do. Sold their house, got rid of it, got them an RV, and took off. You know what they did? Did that a while and went and sold their RV and moved back close to their family because it wasn't something that really brought much fulfillment. But in our country, we've got to the point that you hear a lot about that. But now, what do you hear? You know what I see now in most of the retirement films? Advertisements. Well, you retire from your job as a CEO of some large corporation so that you can start another business and operate it. People seem to understand you have to have something to do. But at the same time, what they're really saying is the only thing that gives value to your life is your employment. That if you remove your employment from your life, you don't really have any value. Well, that's not true. And we need to realize that we can't decide that the top priority in our life is to build our career. If that's the top priority in your life, then you have a pretty serious problem. You can't even put your social life up there at the top. I'm talking about your family and all the people that surround you that are important to you. I've seen a lot of folks who've gotten involved in things they ought not because either their spouse or their mother or their father or somebody, and they had such a sense of loyalty that was greater than their loyalty to God. And so Jesus, in Matthew 10, very familiar reading again, says this, think not I'm come to send peace on earth. Now, I'm not come to send peace, but a sword. I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law, and a man's foes should be those of his own household. He goes on to say, he that loveth father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. He's talking about priorities here. Not saying you don't love them at all. He that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. You just think about what he's getting at. What's your priority? Who's the first person? In the Old Testament, there's a very sad statement. You know, when you start talking in absolutes, sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes we make statements in absolute statements that are just wrong. We just get excited and we say something that's not true. Like, that's the worst thing I ever saw. Well, is it really? But when God speaks, it's a different subject, different situation. Do you remember what God said about Ahab? God said he was the most wicked king that Israel ever had. You know why? Because his wife Jezebel stirred it up. That could have been the other way around, and his wife could have been wicked, and he could have stirred it up. I wouldn't argue that point. But that's not the way it was. In this case, Jezebel stirred up something. I mean, you have to remember who Jezebel was. Her father was a king too. A king over a country that had the worship of fertility gods in it, and there was a lot of immorality there, and old Ahab got mixed up in it and caused the whole nation to get mixed up in it and was a real problem. But why? Why did Ahab get mixed up in it? Because his priorities. First thing in his mind was make my wife happy. No matter what. Don't care. And if it means turning against God, worshiping idols, becoming an immoral person, then I'll do that. It'll make my wife happy. Be careful. Understand that excuse making is really just another word for saying that, hey, my priorities are messed up. This first man valued his property more than his relationship with God. The second man valued his occupation more than his relationship with God. And the third man valued his social responsibilities and relationships as more important than God. Now let's think about it for a moment. We said in the beginning that you want to try to deal with symptoms, or do you really want to deal with the root cause? Excuse making is really referring to symptoms. That's what it's doing. I mean, it's trying to say, oh, I'm going to correct the symptom. I mean, it's like if somebody says something, sometimes you say, okay, then I won't do that again. Well, before long they do it again, but they were just kind of brushing it over so that it kind of went out of sight for a while, hoping you'd kind of forget it. Jesus, in Matthew 22, in verse 35, was asked a question. And the question is, which is the great commandment in the law? Now, that's an interesting question. If you were to ask yourself a question in the United States of America, what's the greatest freedom that we have? Well, there's arguments that people have over that. Some people say it's the freedom of speech. That's the greatest freedom that we have. Some, the right to bear arms because it prevents a tyrannical ruler. There's all kinds of answers given to that. Some say it's the right to, we don't have to fear illegal search and seizure. We've got a private place in our home. There are a lot of things they might say. That's kind of the way the Pharisees and the scribes were doing. They were arguing specific points of the law. But when Jesus answered the question, what he said is, I'm going to go down to the root of this thing. I'm going to go down to the root of this thing. Have you ever stopped and think about when you look at the Constitution, it talks about men are endowed with certain inalienable rights? By who? By their Creator. That's a general statement of truth, and everything else in that document rests upon that truth. Exactly in the same way that Jesus said this. He answered the question. He gave him a bonus answer they didn't ask for. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. Would that take care of every problem? If a man loved the Lord his God with all his soul, heart, mind, and soul, and God sent a message to come here, would he say, I got to go look at some land? No, he would not. He would solve that problem. If a man had an occupation and he was really busy and God said, come here and do that, if he valued the Lord more than anything else, what would he say? If a man in his social relationships had people putting pressure on him and God said you can't do that, what would he do? If God is the priority, you know exactly what he'll do. But then Jesus gave him a secondary answer and said, the second's like to this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And then Jesus made this wonderful statement that really says what we're making here. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. When we begin to make excuse, what we really are doing is we are betraying the fact that our priorities are simply not straight. Now, if we give reasons, that's a different thing. If it snows 8 inches and you've got a two-wheel drive car and you can't go and do whatever you're asked to do, then that's obvious. You can't do it. If it rains 2 or 3 drops, that's a different story. One's an excuse and one's a reason. When you look at this answer, you know what he's saying. And you know that he's telling you that you don't have to talk about all the individual things. If you love the Lord above all, then your answers will not be things that are excuses. Sorry. You know, the reason that Jesus answered the question as he did is that you can't heal an illness by treating the symptom. I one night watched many years ago a program. Dan Miller used to be a local news anchor on Channel 4 here. And he had a late night show on Saturday night, and he interviewed a career criminal one night. And he was talking about prison system, and he was talking about it being the Department of Corrections. Now, this is a guy who had been in prison repeatedly. He had become an old man and finally changed his ways. And this man who had been in prison repeatedly says, there's only one person that can correct you, and that's you. A prison system will not. You can, it can't. You're the one that makes that decision. I want you to read what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, verse 33 through 35. Either make the tree good and his fruit good, or else make the tree corrupt and his fruit corrupt. For the tree is known by its fruit. O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? That's a good question. You think about it. How can ye, being evil, this is talking about your heart, this is talking about where you set your priorities and what you consider to be important. For out of the heart, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. A good man out of the good treasure of the heart bringeth forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure bringeth forth evil things. We need to learn that in this country. A few weeks ago, we had a lesson that was entitled, What's Wrong with Our Country? We dealt with the Ten Commandments and looked at many of the problems that we have. But they still all boil back to one thing. What is the priority in your life? Is it to please God? If it is, it would solve all problems. Excuse making is simply a way of covering up the real problem. When we make an excuse, really what we're doing is in this case, these people who made these excuses, I'm going to look at some land, I've got to look at some oxen, part of my business, or I've married a wife and I can't come. What was the real reason that none of them went? They didn't want to. That's the truth. The truth is they didn't want to go. They didn't say that because it doesn't sound very good. But they didn't want to. We need to stop and think sometimes. What is it that we need to be dealing with? I know, and I used to be one of them. I used to complain about preachers who speak in generalities. And I thought, man, preachers hellfire and brimstone and take specific things and just hammer them home. I'm not arguing that may not be the case in some cases, but in reality, there's an old saying that we have stated many times, that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So you can't beat somebody into submission. I remember Carol Sutton used to talk about when people would say you didn't use much tact. He would say, you know what? If a man wants the truth, you can't beat him off with a stick. And if he doesn't want the truth, you can't beat him into submission with a stick. It's the heart. Think about it. You need to repent and be baptized for remission of sins. On the day of Pentecost, those that gladly received His Word did that. What was it? Their heart was receptive. And we need to think about that as together we stand as we sing.